The ships that never landed. A sleep story of the Spanish Armada, July to August 1588. Part 1. Settling in the world of 1588. Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. Settle yourself down now, wherever you are most comfortable. If you're lying in bed, let your body sink just a little deeper into the mattress beneath you. Feel the weight of the blanket resting across your legs, your chest, your arms. Notice how warm it is there, underneath. Notice how still the room is. Take a slow breath in, hold it for just a moment, and let it go. Good. We are going to travel tonight, not far from where you are, not really, but through time, all the way back to the summer of 1588. Back through 400 years and more, to a world of wooden ships and canvas sails, of grey water and salt wind, and the sound of the sea against the hull. 1588. The world was a quieter place then, in most ways. The nights were very dark. No electric light anywhere. No glow on the horizon from a distant city. Just stars overhead, and the moon when it showed itself, and sometimes a candle in a window far away across a field. And the sea was just the sea. It is always just the sea. The same grey-green water it has always been. The same long, slow swells moving through it, one after another, endlessly, like the breathing of something very large and very patient. The same wind skimming the surface and lifting little ridges of white foam that appear and dissolve and appear again. The sea does not change very much. That is one of the comforting things about it. In the summer of 1588, the waters around England and Spain and Portugal were full of ships. More ships than most people alive at the time had ever seen gathered in one place. 130 ships sailing together in a great formation, moving slowly northward through the Atlantic Ocean. 130 ships. Some of them were enormous. The largest wooden vessels ever built up to that point in the history of the world. Great galleons with sides rising 4 and 5 stories out of the water. Towering wooden castles at the bow and the stern, painted in reds and golds and deep ocean blues. Cannons, hundreds and hundreds of cannons, lining the gun decks in long, dark rows. And some of the ships were smaller. Supply vessels, hulks they were called, wide-bodied cargo ships that rode low in the water, heavy with barrels of biscuit and dried fish and fresh water and gunpowder. Smaller pinnaces that darted around the edges of the fleet, like quick silver fish around something much larger and slower. Together, they formed a shape. This fleet, when seen from above, if a bird had flown high enough overhead and looked down, a crescent shape, like the last sliver of the moon on a clear night. The tips of the crescent stretched for miles across the water, and the body of it was dense with masts and sails and rigging. It was called the Armada, La Armada Invincible. Some people were already calling it, though that name would carry a heavy irony before the summer was done. The Invincible Fleet. But we are not in a hurry tonight. We are not rushing towards the battles or the storms. We are going to drift into this story the way a ship drifts into harbor. Slowly, with the sails coming down one by one, with the anchor dropping quietly into the still water, with the hull coming to rest at last. So let your breathing slow a little more. Let your shoulders soften. We have all the time we need. The man who ordered this fleet into being was Philip II of Spain. He was 59 years old in the summer of 1588, and not in good health. He suffered from gout, which made his joints ache and his feet swell. He moved slowly through the vast stone corridors of the Escorial, his palace outside Madrid, that enormous grey building in the mountains, all straight lines and right angles and silence. Philip was a careful man, a patient man. He spent most of his days at a desk, reading documents. Thousands and thousands of documents. Reports from governors in the Americas, in the Philippines, in Italy, in the Low Countries. Letters from ambassadors and priests and merchants and spies. He read them all, and he wrote notes in the margins in his small, neat handwriting. He had been planning this enterprise, this great enterprise against England, for years, many years. It had grown in his mind slowly, the way a storm gathers out at sea, almost invisible at first, just a darkening on the horizon, and then larger and larger until it fills the whole sky. His reasons for wanting to invade England were many. England under Queen Elizabeth had become Protestant, and Philip was a devout Catholic. England was sheltering and financing Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, where a long and costly war was grinding on year after year. English privateers, men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, had been raiding Spanish ships and Spanish ports and Spanish treasure fleets for decades, stealing silver from the mines of Peru and gold from the rivers of the New World. And then there was the matter of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been executed by Elizabeth's order in February of 1587. Mary had been Catholic. Her death had caused outrage across Catholic Europe. Philip had his reasons. He had accumulated them slowly, the way a man gathering dry wood for a fire gathers stick after stick until the pile is very large indeed. And in 1588, he lit the fire. The man he chose to command the Armada was Alonso Perez de Guzman, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was 37 years old. He was wealthy, well-connected, deeply respected in Spain as an administrator and as a nobleman. He was also, by his own frank admission, not a sailor. When he received Philip's letter ordering him to take command of the fleet, He wrote back immediately, in great distress. He explained that he suffered terribly from seasickness. He explained that he had no experience commanding a naval force. He asked, with all respect and humility, to be relieved of this enormous responsibility. Philip's reply was gentle but firm. Medina Sidonia would command the Armada, and so he did. He traveled south to Lisbon, where the fleet was assembling, and he threw himself into the work with everything he had. He was not, it turned out, a bad commander. He was organized, methodical, fair-minded. He worked long hours. He wrote careful reports. He worried constantly about supplies, about the condition of the ships, about the readiness of his men. And his worrying was, in many ways, entirely justified. But in the spring and early summer of 1588, none of those worries had yet fully materialized. The fleet was nearly ready. The ships were being provisioned. The soldiers and sailors were coming aboard. The great crescent was beginning to take shape in the wide harbor at Lisbon, sail by sail, mast by mast. Let yourself imagine that harbor for a moment. The Tagus River, wide and slow and brown, flowing into the Atlantic. The city of Lisbon rising on its hills above the water, all white buildings and terracotta rooftops in the early summer sun, and filling the river and the harbor beyond it. The ships, so many ships, their mass rising like a bare winter forest against the sky. Their hulls painted and gilded and carved with the shapes of saints and sea monsters and coats of arms. The smell of tar and salt water and timber. The sound of hammers and saws and men calling to one another across the decks. The creak of ropes under tension. The slap of water against wood. It was an extraordinary sight. Even people who had lived all their lives near the sea said they had never seen anything like it. Part 2. The fleet set sail. The Armada finally left Lisbon on the 28th of May, 1588. It was a slow departure. These things always are when so many ships are involved. You cannot simply cast off 130 ships at once. It takes time. The anchors come up one by one, clanking and dripping. The sails are unfurled slowly, the heavy canvas dropping and then catching the wind and billowing out. The ships begin to move, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, drifting forward through the brown river water, then picking up pace as they reach open water. It takes hours, an entire day even, for a fleet of this size to clear a harbor and form up in the open sea. And then there is the wind to consider. The wind is never quite right. It is too strong or too weak, or coming from the wrong direction, or shifting unpredictably, just when you have adjusted your sails to match it. Sailing a ship requires constant attention, constant small adjustments. Sailing 130 ships in formation together requires that same constant attention multiplied by 130, and then multiplied again by the need to keep all those ships in their proper positions relative to one another. It is slow work, it is patient work. It is the kind of work that fills long, quiet hours with small, repetitive tasks. Adjusting a rope here, watching the horizon there, checking the compass, checking the other ships, watching the sky for signs of weather. There is something deeply restful about imagining it, even though, at the time, it was anything but restful for the men doing the work. Imagine yourself on one of those ships. You're standing at the rail, a wooden rail, smoothed by many hands over many years, warm in the May sunshine, and you're watching the coast of Portugal slide slowly past. The cliffs are pale ochre and sandy brown, and the sea at their base is a deep, clear blue-green, darkening to navy further out. Seabirds are wheeling overhead, white against the blue sky, crying their sharp cries and then gliding away on the wind. The deck moves gently beneath your feet. A long, slow rise as a swell passes under the hull, and then a long, slow fall. Rise and fall, rise and fall. The ropes creak softly. The sails above you make a low, continuous breathing sound as the wind moves through them. You can smell the sea, that clean, cold, mineral smell that you cannot describe properly to someone who has never encountered it, but that once known is never forgotten. And around you, on all sides, stretching as far as you can see in every direction, the other ships of the Armada are moving too. Their white sails brilliant in the sun, their colored pennants and flags streaming in the breeze. The whole vast fleet moving together, slowly, northward. You're part of something enormous, something that has never existed before and will never exist quite like this again. But for now, in this moment, it is simply movement. Simply the ship moving through the water moving past the ship. The sky turning slowly overhead as the hours pass. It is enough to watch. It is enough to breathe. The voyage did not go smoothly from the start. Before the fleet had even cleared the coast of Portugal, storms began to trouble it. Not the great catastrophic storms that would come later. Those were still months away. But enough to scatter the ships and damage some of the rigging and make clear that this grand enterprise was going to be harder than anyone had quite anticipated. The fleet put into the port of Corunna in the northwest corner of Spain in June. It sheltered there for several weeks, making repairs, taking on more fresh water and provisions, waiting for better weather. And in that harbor at Corunna, the waiting began. Waiting is a large part of what sailors do. Perhaps the largest part. The actual sailing, the dramatic purposeful movement across the open sea takes up much less time than the waiting. Waiting for wind, waiting for tide, waiting for orders, waiting for weather, waiting for ships that are late to arrive, waiting while provisions are loaded, barrel by barrel, into the hold. The men of the Armada waited at Corunna through the long June days. They mended ropes and patched sails. They cleaned their weapons and polished their armor. They played cards and dice in the lower decks when they were off duty. They prayed. These were very devout men, most of them, and the fleet's chaplains held daily mass and led the rosary in the evenings, and the sound of prayers in Spanish and Portuguese drifted across the water from ship to ship as the sun went down. At night, the harbor was quiet. The ships rocked gently at anchor. A few lights burned here and there, lanterns on the watchkeepers' posts, the glow of the Admiral's great stern lantern on the flagship San Martin. The stars were brilliant overhead in the clear summer nights, and Medina Sidonia wrote more letters. Long, careful, worried letters to the king. He worried about the food. Some of the provisions were already spoiling. The barrels of biscuit had gotten wet in the early storms and were going moldy. The fish was turning. The water in some of the casks was already starting to smell. He worried about the men. There were over 19,000 of them on the ships. Soldiers and sailors and servants and priests and surgeons and gunners and boys who had signed on to learn the trade. Many of them were already getting sick. Dysentery moved through the lower decks. Fevers came and went. He worried about the plan itself. The plan was to sail north, up the coast of Spain and France, across the Bay of Biscay, through the English Channel, all the way to a point off the coast of Flanders, where the Duke of Parma, Philip's best general, commanding a large and experienced Spanish army in the Netherlands, would be waiting with his troops in shallow draft boats, ready to cross over to England. The plan required perfect coordination between the Armada at sea and Parma's army on land. It required that the Armada hold position in the open sea off Flanders, a famously dangerous, shallow, shoal-ridden stretch of coast, while Parma's men embarked. It required, in other words, that the Armada do something sailing ships of the 16th century were extremely ill-equipped to do: hold still in a hostile sea while waiting for something to happen. Medina Sidonia could see the difficulties, but the king had given his orders, and so, in mid-July, the fleet left Corunna and turned north into the open Atlantic. Let's slow down here for a moment and just be with the sea. Because that is where we are now. Out on the open Atlantic, July of 1588. The coast of Spain has fallen away behind, growing smaller and smaller, until the hills become a thin line on the horizon. And then that line disappears too, and there is nothing in any direction but water. Water and sky. The sea is a deep blue-gray today, the color of old pewter. Long swells move through it from the northwest, slow and smooth. The kind of swells that have been traveling for hundreds of miles before they get here, rolling in from the open ocean, unhurried, immense. The ship rises on each one. You feel it under your feet, that slow upward tilt, the bow lifting, and then the long glide up to the crest, and then the bow tilting down again as you slide into the next trough. Up and over and down, and then the next one begins. It is a rhythm as old as the ocean itself. Up and over and down. The sails are full today. A good steady wind from the southwest. The canvas is taut, the rigging taut, and the ship is moving at a comfortable pace. Perhaps 3 knots, perhaps 4 on the better gusts. Not fast. A person can walk faster than this on land. But out here, on the open ocean, with the horizon the same in every direction, and no landmarks to judge speed by, it feels right. It feels like the proper pace for crossing such an enormous space. The sound of the ship at sea is something you could fall asleep listening to, given the right circumstances. The deep bass creak of the main timbers as the hull works in the swell. Every wooden ship does this. The planks and frames and ribs shift against one another very slightly as the hull bends and flexes in the water. It is not alarming. It is the sound of a living vessel, a vessel that is doing what it was built to do. Under that, the constant low hiss of water along the hull. The sea flowing past just a few feet below where you stand. A continuous whisper, rising and falling slightly as the speed fluctuates. And above all of it, the sails, they breathe. That is the only word for it. On a steady wind, the sails breathe. A slow rhythmic expansion and contraction, a soft boom and settle as each gust fills them and then eases. Breathe in and out and in, like the ship itself is sleeping, dreaming of the harbor it has left and the harbor it is making for. Part 3. The English Channel. On the 19th of July, 1588, a lookout on a small English pinnace called the Golden Hind spotted the Armada. He was far out at sea, west of the Lizard Peninsula, the southernmost tip of England, in the long grey twilight of a July evening. The sea was hazy, and out of that haze, filling the horizon from south to north, came the sails. So many sails. He turned his ship and ran for Plymouth, as fast as the wind would carry him. In Plymouth Harbor, the English fleet was at anchor. Its commander was Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord High Admiral of England. And among his captains were some of the most famous sailors of the age: Francis Drake, Martin Frobisher, John Hawkins. The story that is most often told about this moment is that Drake was playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the news arrived, that grassy clifftop above the harbor with its long view out to sea, and that he calmly insisted on finishing his game before attending to the Armada, remarking that there was plenty of time to finish the game and beat the Spanish too. Whether this is exactly true or not, nobody can say for certain now. It may be. It sounds like Drake. He was that kind of man, cool, deliberate, theatrical in his confidence. A man who understood that visible calm in a commander spreads through the ranks like warmth from a fire. But the practical reality was also true. The English ships needed to wait for the tide before they could leave Plymouth Harbor. They could not simply charge out to meet the Armada in the dark. There were rocks and shoals to navigate. There was the matter of the wind, which was blowing from the southwest directly into the harbor mouth, making it difficult to sail out. They would need to warp their ships out by rowing anchors ahead and hauling the vessels forward. Hard, slow work in the dark. And so the night passed. The men worked. The tide turned. The ships moved slowly out of the harbor and into open water. By morning, the English fleet was at sea, and the Armada was coming. Imagine the view from above, if you could see it. The southwestern tip of England, Cornwall, green and rocky, jutting out into the grey Atlantic. The English Channel opening up to the east. That long, narrow seaway between England and France, barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, widening as it goes east toward the North Sea. And in that channel, moving slowly from west to east, the Armada, the Great Crescent. 130 ships, their formation still more or less intact after the long voyage north. The big galleons in the center, the outer wings curving ahead like the horns of a bull. And behind the Armada, keeping pace, staying close but not yet attacking, the English fleet. Smaller ships mostly, lower in the water, with less of those towering wooden castles at bow and stern, built for speed and maneuverability, more than for carrying soldiers or intimidating enemies by their sheer size. The two fleets moved together through the channel like this for days. Days. This is one of the things that surprises people when they first learn about the Armada campaign. How long it took. How slow it was. How there were days of sailing and watching and positioning before any serious engagement took place. There were skirmishes, certainly. The English would dart in, fire their guns, and pull away before the Spanish could come to close quarters. The Spanish would try to close with the English ships and board them. That was their preferred tactic, to come alongside an enemy vessel and throw grappling hooks and send soldiers over the rail. They were very good at that. Their soldiers were arguably the best infantry in the world at this point. In a hand-to-hand fight on a ship's deck, the Spanish expected to win. But the English would not be caught. They were faster, their ships were more nimble, and their captains had been sailing these exact waters for their entire lives. They knew every tide, every current, every shoal. So the two fleets moved east through the channel, day after day, in a strange, slow dance, close but not touching, watching each other, probing. And the days passed with the particular quality that days at sea have when nothing decisive is happening. Long and quiet and somehow suspended, as if time moves differently out here on the water, more slowly, more gently than on land. On the morning of the 21st of July, a Sunday, the first real engagement took place off a headland called Eddystone Rock. The English attacked the rear of the Armada, the squadron commanded by Juan Martinez de Recalde, one of the most experienced naval officers in Spain. Recalde's ships formed up to face the English, and for several hours, the two sides exchanged cannon fire at a distance of perhaps 300 or 400 yards. The noise of those guns, even imagining it from this distance of centuries, it is impressive. Each cannon, and the Armada carried perhaps 2,000 of them, and the English fleet another 1,000 or more. Each cannon was fired with a charge of black powder that produced a tremendous boom, a great rolling thunderclap, and a cloud of thick white-gray smoke. When dozens of guns fired together, the sound was almost incomprehensible. It rolled across the water and echoed back from the cliffs of the English coast. It was heard by people on shore who stopped what they were doing and looked out to sea, straining their eyes through the cannon smoke to make out what was happening. And then the smoke would drift and clear for a moment, and they could see the ships, the sails and the flags and the hulls, still there, still moving. And then another broadside and more smoke, and the sound rolling in again across the water. After several hours, the English drew off. The damage on both sides was modest. Some rigging cut, some hulls pierced, some men killed or wounded. Nothing decisive. The Armada's formation was still intact. It continued moving east, and the English fleet continued following behind. That night, something happened that gave the English their first real advantage. One of the Spanish ships, the Nuestra Señora del Rosario, flagship of the squadron from Andalusia, suffered an accident. In the darkness and confusion of the evening, she collided with another Spanish vessel. The collision carried away her bowsprit, the long pole that juts forward from a ship's bow, and damaged her foremast. She fell behind. She lost steerage. She was in serious trouble. Medina Sidonia faced a hard choice. He could send ships back to protect the Rosario and her admiral, Pedro de Valdez, a distinguished and valuable officer. Or he could keep the fleet together and maintain the formation. He kept the fleet together. It was probably the right decision militarily. Breaking formation to rescue a crippled ship would have exposed the whole fleet to attack. But it meant leaving Pedro de Valdez and his crew behind. And in the night, Francis Drake found them. Drake had been assigned to lead the English fleet through that night, to carry the light that the other ships would follow. But in the darkness, he had extinguished his lantern and slipped away, following a rumor, or perhaps his own instinct, toward those crippled Spanish sails. By morning, Drake had the Rosario, 500 men surrendering without much of a fight, demoralized by their abandonment. And on board the Rosario, Drake found something immensely valuable. Treasure. Gold. The payroll for the Armada. 52,000 gold ducats. Drake sailed back to the English fleet, carrying his prize. Some of his fellow captains were furious with him for leaving his post in the night. Lord Howard gave him a chilly reception. But Drake was Drake, and the English fleet had its prize. In the cold grey light of the following morning, the channel stretched away, east and west, the water dark and steady, and the two fleets were still there, still watching each other, still moving east together, in that slow, deliberate dance. Part 4. GRAVELINES. The heart of the matter. The days continued to pass. The 22nd of July, the 23rd, the 24th, and 25th, which were quieter days, the two fleets maintaining their positions relative to each other, neither side able to force a decisive conclusion. Let the days pass gently, one after another, the way they do on the open water. The weather in those late July days was variable. Sometimes clear and bright, with a good sailing wind and the channel sparkling in the sunlight, the white cliffs of England visible to the north, and the low green coast of France to the south. Sometimes grey and overcast, the horizon blurring into the sky. A fine mist of rain beading on the rigging and darkening the sails. The men on both sides were tired. Sea voyaging is exhausting in ways that are hard to convey to someone who has not done it. It is not the dramatic exhaustion of a battle, but the slow, grinding fatigue of constant vigilance, of sleeping in short intervals, of being cold and wet and cramped below decks, of eating bad food, of worry. Both fleets were running low on gunpowder and cannon shot. The English were closer to their home ports, and supply ships were meeting them with fresh provisions. The Spanish had no such relief coming, and the Spanish were approaching their goal. On the 27th of July, the Armada anchored off the port of Calais, on the French coast, the closest point of the continent to the English shore. Just across that narrow grey strip of water, barely visible on clear days, were the white cliffs of Dover and the green fields of Kent. Medina Sidonia sent word to the Duke of Parma. The fleet was here. The army should embark. Parma's reply was not encouraging. His troops were not ready. The shallow draft boats that would carry his soldiers across were not assembled. It would take days, at least 6 days, before the army could move. And there was another problem. The port of Dunkirk, where Parma's boats were gathered, was blockaded by a Dutch fleet of small, nimble warships called flyboats. These flyboats were fast and shallow drafted, perfectly suited to the sandbanks and shoals off the Flemish coast. They sat off Dunkirk and watched, and they would not let Palmer's boats out. The Armada, with its great deep-hulled galleons, could not operate in those shallow waters. It could not clear the Dutch flyboats. It was stuck in the deep water, while the shallow water that mattered remained out of reach. Medina Sidonia waited at Calais, at anchor, in the dark. He did not have long to wait. The English understood that the Armada at anchor was the Armada at its most vulnerable. Ships at anchor cannot maneuver. They sit where they are, pulled gently by the tide, but otherwise fixed, their anchors holding them in place. And so the English prepared a weapon they had used before against the Spanish fleet in Cadiz harbor the previous year. Fireships. 8 old merchant vessels were selected. They were packed with anything that would burn: wood, pitch, tar, old rope, gunpowder. Their guns were loaded, double-shotted, so that when the fire reached them, they would go off on their own. At midnight on the 28th of July, the fireships were set ablaze and sent downwind toward the anchored Armada. Imagine that sight. 8 ships burning. The fire reflecting in the dark water beneath them, doubling itself. A great orange and gold and red glow moving through the night. The flames climbing the masts and sails, the rigging burning and falling in long, bright streamers. The ships moving in the darkness, piloted only by the wind, straight toward where the Armada lay sleeping at anchor. The lookouts on the Spanish ships saw them coming. The alarm was raised. Panic, or something close to it, spread through the fleet. The captains ordered the anchor cables cut. There was no time to haul the anchors up properly. Cut the cables, let the anchors fall to the bottom of the sea. Get the ships moving. And so the Armada, that vast, careful, disciplined crescent formation that had been maintained across hundreds of miles of ocean, scattered. Ships ran for the open sea in the dark, their anchors lost, their formation broken, trying to avoid the burning vessels bearing down on them. It was chaos. Ships came close to colliding with each other in the darkness. Captains shouted orders that could not be heard over the roar of the fire and the noise of the wind. The fire ships themselves, miraculously in the dark, in the confusion, did not actually hit any of the Spanish vessels. They drifted through the fleet and past it and grounded on sandbanks, burning themselves out harmlessly. But they had done their work. The formation was broken. The Armada was scattered. And when dawn came on the 29th of July, the English fleet was waiting. The Battle of GRAVELINES was the decisive engagement of the whole campaign. It lasted most of the day. The English came in close, closer than they had been before, within 100 yards sometimes, close enough that the cannon shot was doing real damage to the Spanish hulls, rather than just passing through the rigging overhead. The Spanish ships, scattered and disorganized, tried to reform. Some of them managed it. Others were caught, isolated, and hammered by multiple English vessels at once. 3 Spanish ships were sunk or driven aground that day. Many others were badly damaged, hulls holed, masts shot away, guns dismounted, men killed and wounded. And then the wind shifted. The wind had been blowing from the west, pushing the Armada toward the shallow sandbanks of the Flemish coast. The sandbanks were close, very close, and Medina Sidonia could see them. The pale water where the sea shallowed over sand, the breakers at the edge. The Armada was being pushed toward them and could not sail back against the wind. Some of the pilots were already saying, "There is no escape. We are going to ground here on these sandbanks in the shallows, and the English will pick us apart at their leisure." Medina Sidonia stood on the deck of the San Martin and watched the sandbanks coming closer, and he ordered the anchors dropped. Every ship that still had an anchor dropped it. The cables ran out, went taut, and the ships brought up, shaking in the force of the tide, hovering on the edge of the shallows. The English fleet stopped outside artillery range and watched. And then the wind shifted. It backed around to the southwest. A new wind, a saving wind, and the sandbanks were no longer a threat. The Armada could move. It could sail north, away from the Flemish coast, away from the English fleet, out into the deeper water of the North Sea. Medina Sidonia held a council of his officers. Their options were laid out, one by one. Return south through the Channel, back towards Spain. Impossible. The English fleet was there, between them and home. The wind was against them. They could not force their way back. There was only one option. Go north, around Scotland, around Ireland, the long way home. Part 5. The long way home. And so the Armada sailed north, out of the English Channel and into the North Sea, leaving England behind on the left-hand side as they sailed, past the low shores of Norfolk and Lincolnshire, grey-green in the summer haze, past Yorkshire, where the cliffs began to rise again, past the Farne Islands, where great colonies of seabirds wheeled and cried, toward Scotland, toward the wild northern waters. The English fleet followed for a while, but only for a while. They were running out of provisions, out of shot, out of powder. When they reached the latitude of the Firth of Forth, the Scottish border in the sea, Lord Howard turned his fleet south and sailed back toward home. He left a message, in a manner of speaking, for the Spanish. A note was sent ahead, by fast vessel to the English ambassador. Tell them that if they try to come back south, we will be waiting. But the Armada did not try to come back south. It sailed north, and then northwest, and then west, around the top of Scotland, past the Orkney Islands, those treeless, windswept, beautiful islands at the very top of Britain, where the sea runs cold even in August, where the currents are strong and the skies are enormous, and the light on summer evenings lasts almost all night. For a moment, let us rest here among the Orkneys. The sea here is a deep, cold, clear grey-green, a different color entirely from the grey-brown of the Channel or the blue of the Atlantic further south. The waves are short and steep, built by the wind over relatively shallow water, and they slap against the hulls with a sharp, brisk sound, rather than the long, deep, rolling motion of the open ocean. Seabirds again. Puffins here, with their comic-striped bills, bobbing on the surface and diving with startling speed when a fish appears. Gannets, brilliant white, with their black wingtips dropping from great heights like arrows into the sea. The nights in August up here are brief. It barely gets dark at all. Just a long blue twilight, a dimming of the enormous sky, and then the light begins to come back before midnight even passes. The men on the Spanish ships looked at this light and found it strange and a little unnerving. Their world, Spain and the Mediterranean and the tropical Atlantic, had short twilights and dark nights. This perpetual northern summer dusk felt wrong, out of nature, like a place that had not quite finished being made. They were very far from home. The pilots who were supposed to navigate the Armada around Scotland and Ireland had charts that were inaccurate and inadequate. The waters around the outer Hebrides and the west coast of Ireland were poorly understood by Spanish navigators. The currents, the shoals, the pattern of the storms, all of it was guesswork. Medina Sidonia issued careful orders as the fleet rounded the north of Scotland and turned south along the outer edge of the British Isles. Keep well to the west. Stay out in the deep water. Give Ireland a wide berth, at least 100 leagues to the west of the Irish coast, to avoid the rocks and shoals inshore. For a while, the fleet managed this. The weather in early August was tolerable, not good. The North Atlantic in August is rarely what anyone would call comfortable, but manageable. Winds from the southwest, against which the fleet had to beat laboriously southward. Gray skies, gray seas, the horizon close and featureless. The ships were in poor condition now. The Battle of GRAVELINES had left many of them with damage that had been only partially repaired. Hulls that had been holed were patched with whatever materials were available. Masts that had been shot away, had been replaced, or jury-rigged with whatever wood could be found. And the men were exhausted. They had been at sea for 3 months now. They were hungry. The provisions had long since begun to run out, and rations were short. They were sick. Dysentery had spread through the ships. Scurvy was beginning to appear, that dreadful disease of long sea voyages caused by lack of fresh food. Men who had set out from Lisbon in May, as strong and healthy as any soldier or sailor in Europe, were now thin and hollow-eyed, lying in the lower decks, too weak to work. Medina Sidonia himself was ill, racked with what seemed to be dysentery and exhaustion. He was barely able to stand. He continued writing his dispatches, lying on a cot in his great cabin, dictating when he could not hold a pen. The San Martin sailed on, all the ships sailed on, south through the long gray days of August. And then the storms came. In September, a series of violent Atlantic gales struck the fleet as it moved south along the west coast of Ireland. These were not ordinary bad weather. These were Atlantic storms of real ferocity, the kind that build for thousands of miles of open ocean and arrive on the Irish coast with everything they have gathered. The ships that had survived the Channel and GRAVELINES and the long northward voyage now met something they could not survive. One by one, and sometimes in groups, the damaged, weakened ships were driven eastward by the storms toward the Irish coast. The coast of Ireland is one of the most dangerous in the world. Great cliffs dropping sheer into the sea, and at their bases, rocks, and in the water offshore, shoals and reefs and banks of sand, and the swell, always the swell, rolling in from the open Atlantic and breaking with tremendous force on everything in its way. Ships were driven onto these rocks. Great ships. Ships that had crossed the Atlantic and the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel. Ships that had weathered gunfire and fire ships and everything the English could throw at them, were picked up by the storms and thrown onto the Irish coast like toys. Many men drowned. Many more reached the shore exhausted and half dead, only to face a different danger. The English administration in Ireland had issued orders that any Spanish survivors were to be put to death, as they represented a potential threat to English rule. Some survivors were hidden by the Irish people, who had their own complex feelings about Spanish soldiers and English rule, and who offered food and shelter, and sometimes passage home at considerable risk to themselves. But many did not survive. The exact number of ships lost on the Irish coast and the exact number of men is not known with certainty even now. Perhaps 24 ships were wrecked on the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and the Western Islands. Perhaps 5,000 men died on those coasts. The sea gives and the sea takes. And in September of 1588, it was taking. Part 6, Home and the Quiet End. The ships that survived made it home. Not many of them by the time the reckoning was done. Perhaps 67 out of 130 made it back to Spanish ports. Some in September, some in October, some not until later in the autumn, arriving in ones and twos, battered almost beyond recognition, crewed by skeletal men who had survived on rainwater and whatever they could catch. The port of Santander, on the northern coast of Spain, received many of them. The ships came in through the harbor mouth in the autumn light, October light, thin and golden, the leaves beginning to turn on the hills above the harbor. And the people of Santander came down to the water to watch them arrive. They were not the proud fleet that had left Lisbon in the spring. The gilded carvings on their sterns were battered and faded. The paintwork was peeling and salt-stained. The rigging was makeshift, repaired and re-repaired until it was a patchwork of different ropes and different ages. And the men who came off the ships, they walked unsteadily down the gangplanks, these men who had been at sea for 5 months, and some of them fell on their knees when they felt solid ground beneath them. Some of them wept. Some of them were carried off on stretchers, too weak to walk. Some of them did not make it off the ships at all, dying in harbor after surviving everything the ocean had thrown at them. Medina Sidonia came home to Santander in late September. He was, by all accounts, a broken man, physically ill, exhausted, devastated by the failure of the enterprise he had tried so hard to manage well. He wrote to Philip II immediately. He reported what had happened as clearly and honestly as he could. Philip received the news at the Escorial. He had been praying for the fleet's success. He had been lighting candles and attending masses and reading dispatches from the coast, with growing anxiety as the weeks had passed, and the news had been bad, and then worse, and then terrible. When the final accounting came, the losses, the dead, the ships that would never come home, Philip said, "So the story goes. I sent my fleet against men, not against the winds and waves of God." Whether he actually said this exactly in these words, who can know now? But it has the ring of truth about it. It sounds like the kind of thing a man says when he has done everything in his power and the world has not cooperated. The sea is indifferent to human plans. It always has been. It was indifferent in 1588, and it is indifferent now. It does not care about kings or queens or empires or the ambitions of men who have spent their lives in palaces. It does what it does. It blows when it blows. It wrecks what it wrecks. And now, as we come to the quiet end of this long story, let us linger for a moment over the sea itself, rather than the people who sailed it. Because those people are gone now. Philip II died in 1598, in the same great grey palace where he had spent most of his life, in a room he had arranged so that he could see the altar of the chapel from his deathbed. Medina Sidonia lived on for many more years. He was still alive in 1615 and managed his estates in Andalusia and never commanded a fleet again. Francis Drake died at sea in 1596 off the coast of Panama of dysentery. He was buried at sea, in a lead coffin somewhere off the Panamanian coast, in the waters he'd spent his life sailing. Queen Elizabeth lived until 1603. She never married. She never saw the invasion she had feared for so many years. All these people, the soldiers and sailors and admirals and kings and queens, all of them are gone now, dissolved back into the earth and the sea and the air from which they came. But the sea is still there. The same grey-green water of the English Channel. The same Atlantic swells that move southward past the Orkneys and the Hebrides. The same Irish coast where the storms drove the ships onto the rocks in September of 1588. The same water, the same wind. If you could go there now, to any of those places, the Channel or the Atlantic west of Ireland, the harbour at Santander or the mouth of the Tagus at Lisbon, and if you could stand at the water's edge and look out, you would see what those men saw. The same horizon, the same sky reflected in the moving surface, the same birds wheeling overhead. The water does not remember them, but it carries something of them, perhaps, the way all water carries everything that has ever passed through it. A faint echo, a trace, something so small and subtle that it is more feeling than fact. Let the water carry you now, wherever you are. If you're lying in your bed, feel the mattress beneath you, like the deck of a ship at rest in a calm harbor. Feel the rise and fall of your own breathing, slow, steady, easy, like the long, slow swell of the Atlantic on a quiet day. Rise and fall and rise. The story of the Armada is over now. The ships have come home, those that could. The men have gone ashore. The admirals have written their last dispatches. The king has said his prayers and gone to his desk and read his documents, and the world has turned a little further on its axis, the way it always does, indifferent to the plans of men and the outcomes of battles. Somewhere at the bottom of the sea, off the Irish coast, the anchors that were cut from the Spanish ships in the panic of the GRAVELINES night are still resting in the silt, down in the cold, dark water, perfectly still, perfectly preserved in the cold and the dark. Exactly where they landed more than 400 years ago. Enormous iron anchors, their flugs dug into the sandy bottom, their rings pointing up toward the surface, toward the light, toward the distant moving ceiling of waves that has been passing overhead for all these centuries. The crabs move around them, the fish pass by. The currents shift the sand a little this way and a little that way, year by year, century by century. The anchors do not move. They are resting there still, in the deep, quiet, in the dark. And you can rest there too, in a way, in your imagination, in the comfortable darkness of your own closed eyes, down in the deep, quiet. Let the story dissolve around you, like sea foam on a receding tide. The ships dissolving, the sails dissolving. The sound of cannon fire, long ago and far away, and growing quieter now. Quieter. Just the water now. Just the long, slow breathing of the sea. Rise and fall, rise and fall. The dark water, the cold and quiet dark water. The sand and the silt and the anchors resting. The fish moving silently through the dark. Sleep well, and let the sea carry you. The end.